Chapter 1711. Daisy did not say anything. Knowles approached her and pressed his lips against her forehead. "That's because I won't reject anything that you give me." Her cheeks warmed up all of a sudden, and she pushed him away and got into the car on her own. "Bring me to the hospital." Knowles laughed out loud. Daisy pushed the door of the ward open, and Freya closed the lid of her laptop, raised her head, and looked at the two who came in. "You're quite diligent in coming to the hospital to visit me." Daisy saw her bag that she placed on the counter and looked around. "Where's Colton?" Freya put the laptop aside. "He's left after delivering my stuff. T wanted to ask him to stay with you, lest your unscrupulous family members came and caused you any more trouble." She knew Sandy had been discharged from the hospital, and she was afraid Sandy would come here to settle the score because of the matter. She would not be as worried if Colton were to be here. Freya was astonished for a moment, then lowered her gaze. "Forget it. Are you going to ask him to stay with me so that he'll get the chance to mock and torture me even more? If he were to stay here, it would be embarrassing. I don't have anything to talk about with him, and I don't know him that well." Knowles' gaze stopped on the untouched fruits on the table. "Did my uncle come to visit you?" It was impossible for Colton to bring fruits along when he came here, so others other than Colton must have come to visit Freya. And he guessed that it would be someone from the Pruitts, but he would not place his bet on Ken and her mother. Freya pursed her lips tightly and responded with a faint hum. Daisy walked to the edge of the bed and sat down. "Your father didn't beat you, did he?" Freya sneered, but the smile looked dry. "He won't do so. But he's never had the guts to side with me either." "Knowles." Daisy looked at Knowles solemnly at this moment. "You mustn't let them get away with this." Knowles was astounded for a moment. He then lowered his gaze and let off a smirk. "Of course." At that moment, at the Pruitt Manor, Sandy knew that Freya actually wanted to sever ties with the family and smashed the teacup on the table in wrath. By relying on Daisy Goldman's help, she's turned against her family and doesn't even want to take me as her mother now? Brandon sat on the couch with his head lowered and did not even say a word from beginning to end. At this time, the butler hurried in. "Ma'am, something happened." Brandon lifted his head, and Sandy's expression changed slightly. "What happened?" The butler replied, "Police officers are at the doorsteps, claiming that the young master is a murder suspect, and they're asking us to cooperate with them in the investigation." As soon as he finished saying that, a detective led a few officers into the living room and showed them a document. "Sir, ma'am, we're working on a case that's somehow related to Mr. Ken Pruitt, and we need Mr. Pruitt to come to the precinct with us and cooperate with the investigation." "Is Mr. Pruitt here?" Sandy looked irritated, but she had to force a smile. "Officer, have you made a mistake somewhere down the line? How could my son be suspected of murder? Someone submitted evidence to us saying that the cause of Mr. Reese's death is related to Mr. Pruitt. However, if Mr. Pruitt is innocent, we'll let him go after he cooperates with us in our investigation." Brandon looked dazed and was about to say something, but Sandy immediately claimed, "He's not here, and we can't contact him either." She then clenched her hands secretly. The only person in the world who possesses evidence is Knowles. That B*** must be the one who wants to drag my son down. The police searched the whole matter, but to no avail, and could only leave. Sandy sent a text message to Ken immediately, asking him to go into hiding abroad for a while. When Ken received the text, his expression turned gloomy in an instant. "I got Ian to clean up all the evidence of me killing Jonah, and he would never leave any clue behind." So how did Knowles get his hands on the evidence? He had started having doubts ever since his plan to kill Ian was leaked, and he was even more suspicious now that a spy had already been placed somewhere around him. Chapter 1712. Someone knocked on the door, and Ian walked into the study. "Sir, are you looking for me? I asked you to find the traitor. Have you looked into it or not?" Ken glared at him with his gloomy eyes. Ian lowered his head and seemed to have an idea of how he should respond. Sir, I've already checked it out, but I haven't been able to confirm my investigation just yet. Why the F***ck would it take you so long to confirm something? Ken swept all the documents off the table, walked up to Ian, and grabbed the front of his shirt. Who is it? Ian clenched the hands that were resting on his sides and replied, it's Mr. Matthews's men. He and Knowles have already joined forces, and they know you plan to use Mr. Reese's death to frame him. The veins on the back of Ken's hand bulged. Why would Knowles have evidence of the cause of Jonah Reese's death? I remember asking you to eradicate every piece of evidence related to his death. He glared at Ian and lowered his voice. Did you betray me? Ian was sweating profusely on his back. Sir, why would you think I betrayed you, and how would I do so? Ken looked at him and seemed to want to capture some hint from his expression. After a short moment, Ken let go of him, turned around, and stopped in front of the window. Ian, how have I treated you all this while? Ian lowered his gaze and took a deep breath. You've been very kind to me, sir. I'm glad that you know that. Now, it's time for you to repay me. Ian was startled. Ken turned his head, and his gaze stopped on Ian's face. I'll pay you a sum of money to take the fall for me, and I'll still hire you when you get out of prison. After Ian left the room, Ken made a phone call. Book 2 boat tickets for me to Billmark. I'll be leaving tomorrow. As for Ian, he can't be spared. He did not believe that Ian would take the blame for him and not sell him out to the police. For the sake of making sure, he could only sacrifice him. Colton answered Knowles' call in the afternoon and came to the hospital. Freya was slightly flustered when it was mentioned that the police were searching for Ken. Daisy turned to look at her. Ken is her brother, after all. It's inevitable for her to feel a mixture of emotions when she hears the news. Colton crossed his arms and looked at Knowles. Are you sure that the evidence is sufficient? Didn't you let him be released due to insufficient evidence? The evidence is fake. What? Colton frowned, only to watch as Knowles continued calmly. But the witness is real. Ken had destroyed all the evidence long ago, and the one who had helped him destroy the evidence was Ian. All Knowles had done was create fake evidence in advance and use Maggie as a key person to pull Ian over to his side, leaving Ken in the dark and in chaos. Colton supported his chin with his hand and pondered for a while. Is the witness reliable? Knowles chuckled. We'll just have to wait for the outcome. Colton did not say anything else. He did not know why he had chosen to put his trust in Knowles, but he hoped he did not trust the wrong person. In the middle of the night, Ken's party had already arranged a safe route for tomorrow night. However, for safety's sake, he had already left the villa in the suburbs, and even the villa servants did not know his whereabouts. At the wharf, the factory building located on the east side of the cargo containers was still lit, and Ken's men stepped into the building and stopped beside him. Sir, there's news from our men who were lurking at Ian's residence and were about to make a move. But the police appeared out of nowhere for an investigation and took Ian away. Ken's eyes dimmed. When did that happen? 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Ken's expression became gloomier and gloomier. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon? That's half an hour after Ian left. The police have made a move so quickly? Or is it an ambush? He calmed down. At what time will the boat arrive? Chapter 1713. The man replied, about 9 a.m. On the other side of the town, in the precinct. The two officers who had the night shift brought Ian into an interrogation room, and Knowles was already in the room. Ian was handcuffed, walked up to the seat across Knowles, and sat down. Perhaps what you said is right. Knowles glanced at him while tapping on the table with his knuckles. You should thank the officers for arriving at the scene in time. Otherwise, you'd be a corpse by now. Their deal that night was that Ian would become a witness of the case, and he would keep Maggie safe. Ian was an accomplice as he had eradicated the evidence of Ken killing Mr. Reese for Ken. Hence, in order to avoid being wanted by the police, Ken would definitely get Ian to be his scapegoat. Knowles bet on the fact that Ken would rather trust his own judgment than trust Ian to take the fall for him willingly. If he wanted to be safe and sound, Ian must disappear from this world. As long as Ian was dead, there would no longer be any proof, neither evidence nor witness. Ken wanted to get rid of Ian secretly, but he did not know that the police had been waiting for them from the shadows at Ian's residence. That was why Ian was saved. "Is Maggie safe?" he asked. Knowles responded indifferently. "Ken can't even save his own *SS now. It's only natural for him not to have the time to burden himself with how Maggie is doing. My men have transferred her to a safe place, so don't worry." Ian did not utter a single word. Knowles got up slowly and reassured him, "Don't worry about it. Although you're an accomplice, the law will be more lenient for your crime since you're willing to testify in court. And I found you a lawyer. Throughout this lawsuit, I'll try to ensure that the punishment you take for the crime is the least you deserve. And Maggie will wait for you to complete your sentence." Ian lowered his gaze. "Thank you." Knowles walked out of the precinct. The headlights of the car parked in the dark compound were still turned on, and Edison was waiting for him in the car. When he got into the car, Edison said, "Ken left his residence with his men. He doesn't dare to take a flight openly. It seems that he's come up with other routes and is planning to escape from the country." Knowles smirked. "Did he bring Lara along?" Edison paused for a few seconds, then looked back at him. "How do you know?" Knowles looked out of the dark window. "Lara owns every single penny of Jonah's wealth. Would he be willing to leave her behind and throw the inheritance away?" Edison frowned. "But we don't know the route that he'll take to escape right now. If we were to really let him escape, wouldn't all our efforts be in vain?" Knowles propped his hand against the side of his forehead and scoffed. "If he's bringing Lara with him, not being able to escape successfully is part of his destiny." At 3 a.m., men were guarding the dock to prevent any form of ambush. Ken stood at the entrance and had already gone through several cigarettes in a row, not daring to close his eyes all night. He had been keeping himself very vigilant and even turned off his cell phone. He crushed the cigarette butt with the sole of his shoe and turned back into the room. Lara immediately hid her hand under the pillow. It looked as if she did not expect him to come in at this time and was a little panicked. Ken noticed something, and his eyes turned cold. "What are you trying to hide?" Lara tried her best to remain calm. "Nothing." "Is that so?" Ken approached in an instant, and as he was about to lift the pillow, Lara pounced over, intending to hold it down, but Ken pushed her away. She fell off the bed. Ken took out a cell phone from under the pillow and saw the content on the messages she had not had the time to delete, and his face turned gloomy. Lara, sitting on the ground, shuddered and did not dare look at him. Ken smashed the phone to the ground, and the screen of the phone shattered. The sound made her cover her ears and scream, and the men outside were attracted by the noise. "Sir!" Ken growled. "Get out!" The men exchanged gazes in dismay and withdrew out of the room. Ken grabbed Lara's hair, threw her onto the bed, and forced her to face him. "Who do you expect to come here to save you? Knowles? Are you the one who leaked everything to him?" Chapter 1714. Lara's scalp hurt, looking at the exasperated face and the bloodshot eyes in front of her. "You killed my father, and you're planning to get away with this? I can't let you succeed, Ken Pruitt. Someone like you should go to hell." "If I'm going to hell, what about you?" Ken approached her with a hint of contempt. "You're the one who caused the Reeses to fall to where they are today. Do you really think Knowles would help you willingly? He's just using you. Don't forget, if I hadn't disfigured you, you would have already fallen into Donald's hands and wished you had died." Lara spat at him. Ken turned his face away, his cheeks bulged, and then he slapped her with a backhand. Her body tilted, and blood could be seen oozing out of the corner of her mouth. But she laughed hysterically. "At least I get to see your true colors. Even if I were to fall into Donald's hands, I still think that it'd be better than staying by your side." Ken grabbed her by the chin and wanted to say something when his subordinates rushed in and reported, "Sir, several cars are coming our way." Ken pushed her away, loosened his tie, and turned around. "Immediately take everyone and leave this place, and take a remote route." Ken shoved Lara into the car, then got in the car and left. 2 or 3 cars drove toward the west side of the wharf. The police arrived soon after and realized that the people in the factory had left, so they notified their men to search separately in the southwest direction. It was almost 4 a.m. when Ken's car drove through the remote suburbs and saw a police car not far behind him in the rearview mirror. Lara, whose hands were tied, had tape on her mouth, so she could not shout for help. Seeing that the speed of the car increased, and the police car behind them was losing the chase, her heart was racing. The police helicopter caught up to them and was circling overhead. The people in the helicopter locked on the target below and picked up the walkie-talkie. "Destroy the bridge ahead." The pilot on the other helicopter replied, "Roger that." The officers on the helicopter set up missiles and aimed them at the bridge up front. The artillery shot across the dark night, and a few milliseconds later, a gigantic firework that set off in front of the road let off a shock wave as it destroyed the stone bridge. The stones that were blown in the air caused the car below to brake immediately. It turned left and right to dodge the stones and was forced to stop on the cliff in the end. The bridge in front was blown off in the middle, and thick gray smoke billowed. The police car that came from behind quickly surrounded them, and several men got out of their cars and surrendered. The police aimed their guns at Ken's car. Nala's car arrived slowly and steadily behind the police cars. He looked out the car window, only to see Ken dragging Lara out of the car with the gun aimed at her neck. When the police saw the hostage, they did not dare to act rashly. "Mr. Pruitt, you've been surrounded. Surrender now." Ken sneered and glanced at Lara, his hostage. "Failure at this moment is nothing but death. Surrender is not a word that I have in my lexicon. Dragging another person down to hell with me doesn't sound too lonely to me." Lara's expression changed in an instant, and her body trembled even more vigorously. Knowles appeared in the crowd, and Ken laughed out loud when he saw him. "Knowles, my dear cousin, you're really good at this. Even I've begun to admire you." "I admire you too." Knowles looked at him. "It's a pity that you've always insisted on standing across from me." Ken had ambitions, but he had lost to his own ego after enduring so many burdens and humiliation in the Reeses for so many years, and having already gained some connections in the upper-class circles with the help of the Reeses capital. Chapter 1715. If Ken was not greedy and could stop Lara from making a move on Daisy in time, the Reeses would not have fallen. When a person makes a choice, they should think carefully about the consequences they have to bear. Even if he chose to use Lara to obtain the huge inheritance left behind by Jonah, it would be more than enough for him to use the money to help the Reeses make a comeback. But Ken is unwilling to accept his fate and insists on killing Jonah, wanting to start a war between Knowles and Donald. He even delusionally wanted to make a move on Daisy. The feeling of tasting your own medicine is not very satisfying, isn't it? Knowles lifted his gaze, and his face looked calm. "If you hadn't chosen to escape with Miss Reese, perhaps you would still have had a chance." Ken laughed out loud but restrained his expression in a blink of an eye. "I've always wanted to get rid of this shameful identity of mine all my life. I'm also the 3rd generation of the royal family, however, just because my mother was the illegitimate daughter, nothing has been fair to her. People looked down on me, and everyone was forcing me all this while. When I was a young kid, my mother instilled in me the idea of surpassing you and getting recognition from the royal family. She placed all her expectations on my shoulders, and I was burdened with all these expectations, which weighed a lot. But she's my mother, and I can't disobey her. I couldn't marry the woman I loved the most. I couldn't even take a peep at her when she died in the delivery room. In order to uphold my mother's so-called expectations, I couldn't even recognize my own baby child. After so many years of embarrassment and humiliation, I can finally be free at this moment." Ken wrapped his arm around Lara's shoulder, dragged her to the front while he stood behind her, and pressed the gun in his hand against the artery in her neck. He took a few steps backward. Lara's mouth was sealed with tape, so she could only let out whimpers as her whole body was tense. Nolace frowned. Ken, if you surrender now, salvation is still possible. I can't go to prison, not to mention that I'll never let you have it your way. Ken smiled and pulled the trigger of the gun. The sound of a gunshot pierced through the sky, and Lara gave off a hoarse roar. However, she did not feel any pain. She returned to her senses, realized something, and opened her eyes. With the sound of someone dropping to the ground behind her, she stumbled, sat down on the ground, and turned around to look at Ken, who had fallen into a pool of blood as he had gotten shot. The policeman who had taken the shot before Ken did was soaked in sweat. 2 seconds was all he had had. If he had pulled the trigger 2 seconds later, not only would the suspect have died, but the hostage would have gone down with him too. 2 policemen quickly stepped forward to help Lara up, untied the rope around her wrists, and tore off the adhesive tape. She was probably petrified as she burst into tears instantly. Nala's gaze was fixed on Ken as his body was put into a body bag by the police. They then zipped the bag up, gradually covering his figure. The next day, the news about Ken committing a crime, trying to escape, holding someone hostage, and getting shot and killed by the police made it onto the hottest topic on all major platforms. Ian, as a witness, also appeared in court to confirm the fact that Ken was the person who had killed Jonah. Freya sat on the hospital bed and watched the news on television with a heavy heart. The elder brother, who had stayed with her for over a decade, was dead. Although he was no model to any other elder brother in the world, they were still related by blood. She did not feel devastated or delighted about the news. All she felt were regret and sympathy. The door of the ward was abruptly pushed open, and Sandy broke in. She pounced on her and strangled her as if she had lost her mind. Why must you force him onto a dead end? Why aren't you the one who died? Give my son back. You, give my son back. Hearing the commotion, a nurse hurried into the ward to stop Sandy. Madam. What are you doing? Let her go. Sandy refused to let go, and Freya started to feel suffocated, so much so that she closed her eyes. Daisy and Colton heard the movement in the ward and rushed over. When they saw this scene, Daisy shouted, Freya, chapter 1716. Colton quickly walked forward and pulled Sandy away. She lost her footing and fell next to the bed. Freya coughed loudly and took deep breaths while lying on the bed. The nurse was worried that Sandy would do something outrageous again, so she held her. She didn't seem to be stable and was rambling about cornering her and why she wasn't the one dead. Freya's eyes looked tired. She could see how much Ken's death had affected her mother and how that had made Sandy break down. They were both her children, but only Ken would be the reason her mother was so devastated. Why should she be brought into the world in the first place? Mrs. Pruitt, that is too much. Daisy couldn't stand it anymore. Freya is your daughter, but you want her life, because Ken lost his? Sandy lost her mind and was like an empty shell without a soul. I just want my son. Daisy was going to say something, but Freya spoke first. Enough. She looked down with no expression on her face. There's no need to say anything more. She had already accepted the fact and no longer looked forward to her mother loving her as a daughter. Daisy's hand balled into a fist, and she wanted to ask why Sandy chose to have Freya but not love her. She didn't ask in the end. Sandy was taken away by the nurse and never looked back at Freya. There was dead silence in the room. Freya quietly looked outside the window while the sun shone in. Don't worry about me, I'm fine. I just need to rest. Daisy pressed her lips together. Have a good rest then. She then looked toward Colton. Let's go, Colton. She knew that Freya just needed time to be by herself. Colton nodded and looked at Freya before leaving the room with Daisy. The moment the door closed, Freya's energy left her body, and she fell onto her pillow and bit her lips while she held back her emotions. Meanwhile, Sandy lost her mind because of Ken's death and was admitted to the hospital. When Brandon rushed over, the doctors had already given her a sedative. "How is my wife doing, doctor?" "She is too sad, and her emotions are out of control. She needs to rest. If you have time, please bring her to see a psychiatrist." After the doctor left, Brandon stood at the door and looked inward. He knew how hard Sandy had worked to bring Ken up, and she had put all her hopes and dreams on this son of theirs. However, her hopes ultimately sent Ken down a downward spiral and eventually cost him his life. "Mr. Pruitt." A voice called out to him. Brandon looked back and saw Daisy walking toward him. "Can I have a minute of your time, please?" He nodded and asked, did Faye's mother go see her? He could guess that after Ken's death, Sandy would blame Freya. Daisy looked at him. "Is Freya your child with Mrs. Pruitt?" Brandon paused because he understood what she was asking. He looked down and replied, "Yes." Daisy was shocked. "If she is your own child, how can you treat her that way?" She didn't understand why they were so cruel to their own child. Brandon's face was dark, and he said after a long pause, "Faye is our child, but when her mother learned that she was a girl, she didn't want her. He had to convince Sandy to keep her." Daisy took a deep breath. "Mrs. Pruitt didn't want her because she is a girl? Are girls not still considered a human life?" Chapter 1717. Brandon was silent. Daisy didn't push him, but instead turned and walked away. That was when Brandon spoke up. "I can understand if Faye hates us, but she had a lot more freedom than Ken. She had her freedom and could choose the way she wanted to live without problems and worries. I'm glad about that." Daisy looked at him and left without saying a word. After the school celebration ended, half a year went by. Daisy went to see Freya next door after speaking to her group of friends about the performance. The exam next door seemed to have just ended. The students walked out, and Freya was at the end of the line. Daisy waved at her. When she walked over, Daisy asked, "How was it? Did you pass?" "I guess I have to retake it." She shrugged and accepted it. "It doesn't matter. Acting isn't my only option." Daisy walked next to her. "What do you plan to do after we graduate?" "Write, sell my publishing rights, and try to get a big villa next to the sea before I turn 30. Daisy was startled. "That's it? What more?" Freya smiled. "I have to think about Dee. Daisy slowed down her footsteps, looked down, and didn't say anything. Dee was now an orphan. Freya had been taking care of her since her birth, so she was pretty much her parent. If even Freya left her, nobody would want to keep her. Freya always thought about others and Dee, but not for herself. Daisy pressed her lips together and stopped. "Freya, if I join the entertainment industry, will you be my assistant?" Freya was surprised and looked at her. "Your assistant?" Daisy wouldn't want her to think that she was being charitable, so she said, "You're thinking for Dee. Even if you sell your publishing rights, you need many years to write a book, so you need some money to survive. My mom says that children cost a lot. If you work as my assistant, I'll pay you so you can write comfortably." After a moment of silence, Freya burst out laughing. "You're trying to throw money in my face?" She choked. "That's different." Freya smiled. "I know that you're trying to be kind, but I don't take advantage of people." Daisy paused. Freya walked away and waved without looking back. "It's too soon to talk about this. Tell me when you really need me, and I'll think about it." Daisy watched her walk away, smiled, and ran after her. "Wait for me." Colton and two friends walked past the corridor and looked out the window. He saw Daisy and Freya walking together, with arms around each other's shoulders. The friend with spiky hair looked over too. "Is that your sister?" Colton frowned. "Don't even think about it." The guy smiled. "Your sister has a boyfriend, so I wouldn't be able to do anything. I'm asking about the girl next to her." He didn't get a good look at Freya's face, but she looked like his type just by her body type. Freya was 5 feet 7 inches, and was not skinny nor voluptuous. She had a sporty body. Colton looked back at him, noticed that his eyes were trailing them, and chuckled. She has a kid. Chapter 1718. The spiky-haired friend was shocked. What? But Colton had already walked away. In the evening, at the Hilton Villas. A car parked outside the gates, and Knoles leaned on it while checking his watch. Footsteps approached, and when he looked up, Daisy jumped in front of him with a big smile. Have you been waiting for a long time? She had her dark curly hair up in a high ponytail and picked a black sleeveless A-line dress with a clutch with a chain. She wore white flats and looked lively and adorable. Knoles put out his hand to grab her waist. You dressed up. Daisy looked down and whispered, I have to leave a good impression when I visit your home. He chuckled. You've been there before. It was just that once. It was different. That was during his mother's party, and there were a lot of people there. This was for dinner, so how would it be the same? The car arrived at the Knowles mansion, and Daisy walked behind Knoles into the living room. His father and Tristan were having a chat on the couch, and Tristan smiled when he saw the youngsters. You're here. Daisy politely greeted them. Hello, Mr. Knowles, Uncle Tristan. Rick smiled and nodded. Diana came downstairs and smiled warmly. Daisy is here. She walked toward Daisy, pushed Knoles aside, and held her hand. What do you feel like having for dinner? I'll cook it for you. Daisy was shy. I'm not picky, Aunt Diana. Anything is good. It's great that you're not picky, unlike Knoles and his father. They don't like broccoli. Rick was startled and looked up. Why am I brought into this? She didn't spare him in front of their son's girlfriend. It's the truth. Diana dragged Daisy into the kitchen. I bought a lot of great food. Look around and see if there's something you love. Tristan looked toward the kitchen and chuckled. Diana seems to be very happy about Daisy. Rick could tell that his wife already treated Daisy as her daughter-in-law. We need the Goldmans to agree to it. Daisy was the princess of the Goldmans, so Nolan would have to be willing to let go of this gem. Knoles sat on the couch across from them and calmly said, if Mrs. Goldman agrees, Mr. Goldman will have to. Rick suddenly stopped talking. Tristan looked up. How's Freya? She cut ties with her family. When Rick heard that, he sighed. Having a mother like that is a misfortune. Faye's an understanding person who even takes care of her brother's daughter when she is single. She even has to focus on her studies. That isn't the best option. After that, he pondered for a few seconds. Ask Faye if she would let us take care of Dee Dee. Your mother and I aren't doing anything. She can focus on her studies. Knoles nodded. I'll speak to her about it. During dinner, Diana gave Daisy a lot of food, and she didn't know where to start. Knoles moved her plate over, but Diana had given him some broccoli before Daisy could react. Why are you taking Daisy's food? Here's yours. Knoles was rendered speechless. Daisy looked at his expression and tried to hide her laughter. Meanwhile, Freya packed some food and went to the first-floor window seat but realized that someone had already taken her spot. Chapter 1719. There were 2 seats there. Nobody was around, but there was cutlery, and the food was untouched. One of the chairs had a laptop bag on it. It was to stop people from sitting there. She walked over and placed down her tray of food. Who is this? After saying that, someone approached her and placed a drink in front of her. She looked up, and it was Colton. He moved his bag back to his seat and sat down, then picked up his cutlery and started cutting the steak on his plate. Freya looked around, and there weren't any other seats around. Is someone sitting here? He slowly chewed and didn't look up. No. So you're taking up 2 seats? I don't like to eat with strangers. Freya didn't know what to say. Colton looked up calmly at her. Is there a problem? No. She smiled and picked up her food. I'll leave you to it then. She turned and was about to leave when Colton stopped her. Wait. Before she could react, he calmly said, take a seat. I have questions for you. Freya placed down her tray and sat across from him. Go ahead. Colton fell silent for 2 seconds. I haven't thought about them. She was startled. Are you joking? Colton looked at her but didn't answer. Eat. Freya frowned because she had no idea what was on his mind. To her, Colton wasn't someone who would make jokes, and she thought that he would ask about Daisy or something related to her. He didn't seem interested in anything else other than his sister. It was a little awkward, especially because she was sitting across from him. Someone who didn't want to see her was sitting calmly across from her now. His attitude had changed a lot, especially since the incident with Ian. Still, Freya wasn't used to it. Why are you so careful around me? They were just having a meal, but it was as though he would do something to her. Colton's question made her laugh. Shouldn't it be the other way around? He squinted but didn't speak. Freya ate her soup and said, I'm just surprised. He nodded. Because of Daisy. It was more about his attitude toward her as long as she didn't hurt Daisy. She understood, nodded, and smiled. It's no wonder that Daisy is so innocent when she has such a protective brother like you. She was like a girl who didn't know the evils of the world and still had a unique and rare innocence. Colton looked at her but didn't say anything. He knew about her situation. He had been under the impression that she had a motive when she approached Daisy, and since she was Ken's sister, he didn't like her. She was at most his sister's best friend. Daisy cared about her, and Freya helped them a lot, so there was no need for him to be hostile toward her. She trusts easily. Colton's words carried a hidden message. Lisa was a good example, and now there was Ian. There shouldn't be more. Freya was her friend now, but no one knew what would happen in the future. People would change. Really? Freya smiled. I think she believes in her own judgment. Just because she's sincere doesn't mean she will get that in return. However, that would be better than being deceiving. You can't avoid touching ropes, because you were once bit by a snake. Colton didn't say anything more. The night grew closer. The lights lit up in the huge Knowles garden, flickering along the corridor and swallowing the darkness. Chapter 1720. Daisy finished dinner and walked around the mansion. Upon recalling something, she asked the helpers the directions to Nala's room and walked toward it. She opened the door and saw that the lights were on, but he was nowhere to be seen. His room was spacious and had a grayscale tone and Nordic style. There was a partition with carvings that separated the room and the study. The study was neat and tidy, and there weren't any items on the book racks other than books. Daisy wanted to sneakily look around, but suddenly a figure approached and leaned close to her ear. What are you looking at? Daisy jumped and turned around. The tip of her nose brushed across his cheek, but he was still bending low. He raised his brows. Do you like my room? I was just looking around. She looked away and mumbled, I've never seen it. She didn't expect him to suddenly pop up out of nowhere. Knowles chuckled. Are you still jealous that Lisa had entered my room before? Before she could say anything, Knowles carried her to the desk and put his arms around her, his warm breath on her forehead. This will be your room soon. She had her head hanging low while her face burned. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Knowles lifted her chin and rested his lips on her hairline. I won't give you a chance to turn back. He went lower and stopped on her neck. You can only marry me. He nibbled her neck without any sign. Daisy pressed her hands against his chest. A weird feeling rushed toward her heart, like a jolt of electricity. She felt as if ants crawled around her heart, and she felt warm and fuzzy. Are you a dog? Why did you bite me? Knowles ran his finger over the mark on her neck and smiled. You can bite me back. She laughed and tapped his hand. No way. Knowles rubbed her hair with love in his eyes. Let me drive you home. Daisy nodded. Nolace drove her back to the Hilton Villas. Daisy slowly opened the car door, but he grabbed her wrist, so she turned around. What's going on? He looked at her neck and smiled. You need to hide that. She didn't understand what he meant until the next day when she met Freya at the college. Freya stared at her neck the entire time. Daisy subconsciously touched her neck. What's wrong? Freya asked, did you stay at Nolus last night? Daisy choked, and her face turned red. No, he sent me home. We're not there yet, even though we're a couple. Didn't you look in the mirror before you left home this morning? Freya pointed at her neck. Daisy turned on her front camera and looked at her neck. She then immediately covered it and remembered how Nolace had bitten her. She hadn't noticed that mark when she left home, but she finally understood what Nolace meant the night before. If even Freya thought something happened, Colton might just kill her if he saw it. Nolace, that asshole. She immediately took out her concealer and covered it until it was no longer obvious. Freya rested her chin on her hand and couldn't help but laugh. That's a love bite. You're getting somewhere. Daisy was startled, and her face became even hotter, so she covered Freya's mouth. Stop talking. Meanwhile, at the Knowles group, Edison was reporting to Nolace when his phone buzzed. He ignored it because the other person sent a bunch of texts, and his phone kept buzzing.